So thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about the software that I've been involved with. So I'm currently a research fellow in the maths department at Oxford, but in October I'm moving to a permanent position in Sheffield. So I'm based in the mathematical biology group. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about this tool Chase that was mentioned once or twice earlier today. And I'm not going to tell you too much about the sort of the functionality and kind of how to use it, because Jochen Kursauer, who's looks like that, is going to give a demo about it very soon after. So Jochen is always that enthusiastic. Okay, so basically the sorts of models and simulations that me and other people at Oxford are kind of interested in developing and using code for are these kind of multi-scale models. And so you have systems with maybe tens to hundreds to thousands of cells. We're not particularly interested in much more than a few thousand cells, to be honest. And a lot of the kind of the original application area has been in the gut, so the kind of the tissue self-renewal, and also kind of homeostasis and then carcinogenesis of the intestinal epithelium. So really thinking about how tissues kind of self-organize and how this process goes wrong. Although my current research focuses a little bit more on kind of developmental processes. And I think probably most people here kind of are fairly au fait with the sorts of models. And Matchek gave a great overview of the sort of the different flavors of models that are out there. So this is just a sort of a generic slide on the motivation for kind of what led us to develop our particular piece of software. So basically, I'm claiming that there are two sort of key bottlenecks or kind of issues with preventing kind of accelerated progress in computational science, or at least the use of computational modeling, not necessarily just in the life sciences, but particularly in the life sciences. And so kind of the first is kind of speed of progress. So it's often the case that, perhaps if you're a PI, you have a PhD student, and they come along and they write some code, and they use that code to get a paper, and then they leave, and then the code sort of dies. And so there's this issue of kind of reinventing the wheel. Perhaps the code doesn't die, perhaps another PhD student comes along and tries to use that code. So in fact, I have first-hand experience of this with Jochen when he started his PhD, tried to use some other guy's MATLAB code. And I think Jochen would agree it was a slightly painful experience all around. And a lot of this is due to the fact that sort of even now, most people going through mathematical or physical sciences degrees don't really get any formal training in how to write code, how to develop software. So leading to this issue of spaghetti code. And then also we heard, I think a few times earlier today, about kind of this issue of reliability and reproducibility of code. So if you yourself are writing code, how do you test that the code is doing what you think it's doing? Quite often with these sorts of kind of multicellular simulations, you run the code and then you eyeball it and you kind of say that looks right, or so there's kind of picture norm, if you like. So these are kind of some ongoing issues. So to sort of address some of those issues within the particular application area of multi-scale modeling of multicellular populations, a bunch of us in Oxford, going back to, I think, 2005, as well as some people in Nottingham, decided to sort of spend part of our time contributing to this kind of communal code development effort. And so this is every code needs an acronym. Ours is called Chase. And as Matchek mentioned earlier, if you Google Chase, then you'll find some things not relating to our project. Although I realise this talk is being recorded, so I'd like to state for the record that Chase are against sex trafficking. So Chase stands for Cancer, Heart, and Soft Tissue Environment. It doesn't really matter. So that's the website. So it's basically a C++ library. It's open source. And so it's just sort of a set of functionality for simulating these sorts of problems. It's not sort of a nice kind of graphical user interface, so it's a little bit sort of more onerous than that. It's developed primarily for Linux. People do get it working on OS X. There's anecdotal evidence that 1 or 2 people got it working on Windows, but I'm not sure if I trust that. And there's some sort of statistics here. So just a couple of details about the way that we develop the code. So we use this process called test-driven development. So this slide and sort of future slides, even until quite recently, were sort of a little bit, what's the word, kind of unique in the sense that a lot of people hadn't really, in this community, hadn't really thought about how you develop codes. But within the last few years, obviously, the sort of the number of tools in this area has really exploded. And I think people, are probably sort of well aware of these issues now, or at least increasingly aware. But anyway, so test-driven development is one way for sort of trying to minimize the appearance of bugs in your code. So you sort of, half the code is actually the sort of the source code, the functionality, and then the other half of the code is unit tests that sort of test the functionality in different ways to try and persuade oneself that it's doing the right thing. And there's several different ways that you can kind of test the code. And to try and sort of prove that we're high-tech in 21st century, we have Twitter feeds. And so the first Twitter feed is Chase Project is just, your generic, oh, look, there's a new release of Chase. But what's kind of cool is the second one, Chased Pi. So, the Raspberry Pi, the little computer thing. So we have one set up to tweet every time the whole Chase code is rerun when someone commits some new code. And if the person who committed the new code broke Chased or introduced an error, then this tweets the name of that developer. So this is a way of sort of formalizing the principle of peer pressure. So I suppose if you're interested, you could look at the distribution of different named developers in terms of error rates, but I maybe wouldn't encourage that. So another aspect of the way we develop the code is, so we use kind of principles derived from things like extreme or agile programming. So in particular, this principle of pair programming. So on the right here, you see a picture of two people programming, just in case you weren't able to visualize that in your mind. So it kind of sounds that it would be less productive than just having two people at two computers. But actually, depending on the relative coding skills of them, it can actually be much more productive, because what you're getting is kind of code critiquing on the fly. So the guy at the top there is sort of doing his thing, he's coding, he's writing C++, he's in the zone, and then the guy to his right is saying, you missed a semicolon, that's going to break. And so that's kind of we found that kind of works quite well, although it does require there to be at least two people coding at the same time. So as people have left or joined the project, sometimes it's more sort of singleton programming. Yeah. So in fact, fairly early on, we bought a teddy bear that sits next to a singleton, just so that they don't feel too lonely. So part of the idea of pair programming is we then kind of rotate pairs during a programming session every so often, so that it's really trying to minimize the extent to which one person has written this part of the code, because then that person has responsibility for that part of the code, and if that person leaves or if that person leaves on, then it's sort of it's not ideal. So if you're interested in kind of our experiences of how to adapt these sorts of approaches in a particular kind of academic software development setting, recently we wrote this sort of 10 simple rules paper in PLOS CB for effective computational research. This got a little bit of feedback, some of it not terribly positive, and so if I had my way, I would replace it with 10 simple polite suggestions for effective computational research. I certainly wouldn't claim that they're rules or guidelines. So that's pretty much it. I didn't want to get too much into the sort of the science that's been enabled by Chase, but you can kind of look up the papers, you can chat to Jochen, and also obviously sort of chat to me if you're interested about the sorts of science that we've been doing with. But just as a sort of a final slide, I wanted to kind of highlight some of the challenges that I think have really come out of our experiences of Chase and kind of ongoing challenges that we're grappling with. So obviously these are sort of, I'm biased, and this is what I think is particularly important, and you may think they're not. So sort of broadly speaking, there are kind of mathematical challenges. So for example, to what extent does the prediction of a given model of this form depend on your constitutive assumptions, or even your kind of choice of modeling paradigm, so that, cell-based chase, we've implemented a kind of a wide variety of different ways of simulating. So, for example, cellular automata, cellular pots, vertex models, and that's trying to tackle, to a certain extent, trying to tease apart sort of sensitivity or robustness of predictions to kind of choice of modeling approach, I suppose. And then also sort of statistical issues. So depending on the kind of application area that you're using modeling or that you're working in with modeling, increasingly these sort of models are trying to be placed on a quantitative rather than a qualitative footing. And that immediately kind of opens up all sorts of issues of how do you actually, or at least efficiently do parameter inference, model selection, things like uncertainty quantification in these models. I suppose if a lot of people are interested in cancer modeling, if you actually want to be sort of useful in your modeling and your simulation, you're going to have to sort of say, in some sense, how confident you are in your model, right? There are also computational challenges, so things like robustness of results to what computer you're running your simulations on. An ambiguous definition of models is a massive hornet's nest that I kind of want to take a step away from, to be honest. Like Maciek said earlier, there's just been these year after year of just workshops about trying to establish standards for these sorts of models, and I'm not sure that it's been terribly fruitful. And then also how to improve ease of model construction and exchange, so this notion of interoperability. And then lastly, possibly most significantly, logistical challenges. So, an issue that we found with Chased is, so we've really developed it for our benefit in order to facilitate the science that we want to be doing, but in such a way that it is reproducible and other people can make use of it. But what that means is that we haven't really focused on, for example, kind of user experience or kind of making it easy for someone who doesn't know C++. And so there's this kind of ongoing tension between trying to prioritize kind of improving ease of use by other people, and then if they use your software, hopefully eventually they will cite you, versus actually getting science done yourself. There's also issues of how to ensure continuity and training new users. So people like myself have sort of grown up with Chased, and there's sort of been this sort of slight challenge, right, of getting, if you like, the next generation of developers. And I think the way that we do things, for example, via pair programming and these kind of agile approaches, does reduce that issue, but it's certainly still an issue. And then lastly, how to secure ongoing funding. And again, this is another thing that Maciek made reference to. So in the UK, the research councils, they're slightly starting to wake up to the importance of code maintenance and code development, and they're releasing small pots of money for that sort of thing. But it does seem sort of pretty balmy that it's still that difficult to secure funding to maintain these codes that are of great use not only to the academic community, but also sort of, they have economic value. So with that, I'd like to end. So there's lots of people involved in the Chase software program, either through sort of scientific direction or through actually doing the coding. So these are some of those people. And if anyone has any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them. So thanks for your time.